Hey guys, welcome back to Gotta Be Geek. If this is the first time you're joining into one of my videos, hi, my name is Mike. I am your local super geek here on Gotta Be Geek. And in these videos, I talk about tutorials for various coding languages, various developer tools, and sometimes host tech talks, and all of this to help you be a better engineer or developer. In today's video, I want to talk about React state management. And the long-time, well-known way for many people to do this is Redux. And so we're going to go over adding Redux in this first of two videos for this two-part series. We're going to add Redux to our React project, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. And then in the second video that I'm going to bring in later on at a later date, we'll be adding in React's recently released context API to manage state. And then in that video, I will also kind of give my final opinions and thoughts about the two and how they compare to each other, and my recommendation on when or why you should use one or the other. So without further ado, we'll roll the intro and we'll get right into it. Okay, so the first one I'm going to go over here is going to be React with Redux, just because I think the context API stuff is a little bit newer. So for those of you that are familiar with React and you've probably had some experience with Redux in the past, but whether or not you have had experience with Redux, I decided we'll start with Redux because I think more people will be familiar with that one. So I will go ahead and switch over here so that you can see my screen, and you'll notice here I've just all I've done here is cloned the previous React tutorial repository that I've used in the past. And we're going to go through some changes here before I get Redux in that you don't have to follow along. I'm just going to do it because it's for me. And if you've watched my previous video, which I can have a link on for you in the description and up there for you to click on, is the my kind of favorite parcel bundler comparison, and parcel.js has kind of been my go-to and my favorite. And so when I did the React tutorial one, I had Webpack in here as an example because we had to add things in for you to be able to use React. And because nothing is changing at this point to add Redux in or anything like that, I'm going to go ahead and use parcel.js for majority of my tutorials that you'll probably see in the future videos. But unless it's something that needs Webpack, as an example, I haven't obviously tried for a little bit, but the last time I wrote an Electron project, there was no way that I could figure out to get parcel.js to work correctly with an Electron project. I was only able to do that with Webpack. So in that case, then I would probably use Webpack. But for now on, you'll probably just see me use parcel.js. So because there's a video on using parcel.js and Webpack, I'm just going to go ahead and you'll probably just see a quick cut. I'm going to remove everything to do with Webpack here and switch over to parcel.js, and then I'll go forward. Okay, so I've gone ahead and removed everything that wasn't Webpack or that was Webpack and changed what I needed to for parcel. Again, you don't need to do any of the things here for changing over to parcel. This is just personal preference for me, so I can kind of move through the project. I just like the build speeds and I don't know, I just like it better, I guess. So I have changed this in here, and I've brought in and updated all of these packages to the latest ones so that we can all make sure they work together when following through with this. And I haven't pulled any of the Redux stuff in. I just wanted you to be able to see what I would start with to go to Redux. So the things that we'll need is we need the base Redux package. So we'll go ahead and add that in here. And we'll take the latest, and we're gonna need React Redux, and then we'll want our types for it. And last one. Oh, whoops. Okay, so React or Redux, kind of an obvious one. So Redux and the types for it. And then React Redux is kind of that connecting point, which we'll get to if you haven't been familiar with using Redux, to connect a Redux store or stores to the different UI components. So we'll go through that. So those are the two things that you need, and we'll get moving on to the next piece. So the next one is going to be the TS config. So there's a few changes I'm going to make in here, and as usual, I'll kind of go over them once I'm done. Okay, so the first one is just adding some libraries for the compiler, ES6 being one of them, because we've changed the module to ES6. DOM is just for some of the DOM elements, and then 2015 collection. That one is, honestly can't remember, but there'll be a point where we'll get to it, and I'm pretty sure we need that. If not, then you can remove it. But there's something in here that I end up doing for this that we want that for. And so I will try and remember to come back to that. The next piece is adding in the rest. Oh, skip lib check and skip default lib check was to try and get rid of some problems that it was detecting in some of the libraries. And then force consistent casing and file names, personal preference. I was just going through and adding some stuff in here, and I remembered that one. So you can certainly leave this one out if that's not something that you care about. And then check.js was a new one with TypeScript. When I updated TypeScript, as I was kind of going through this initially, because usually when I do these tutorials, I kind of go through the whole process myself beforehand, just kind of make sure that I'm not completely stumped if something weird happens. In most cases. So when I went through this originally, the something to do with upgrading to TypeScript brought in where if you specified allow.js, you also needed to specify check.js. And so, and I don't know why I put this as true. So you gotta have both now. So then down level iteration, this was for something to do with destructuring that I think I end up doing. I think this is another one of those that I may have added for some weird reason, but I can't remember what it was at the moment. So when I get there, I'll try and remember and bring it up. But that's it for the changes to the TS config. And so with that, we'll get moving on to adding in the rest of the stuff. Oh, before we do that, obviously beforehand, I didn't, once we were done getting all these packages in here, we're gonna need to do that. So I will do this. I'm not gonna hang up the video on this for you to watch this. So I'll skip forward before this is finished here in a second. Just remember that you'll obviously need to go install your npm packages. And when I cut through, we'll be starting on the next piece that we need to add. Oh, and for those of you that are following along with the switch over to Parcel.js, for those of you that wanted to do that, there is an additional step. For any of you that are not going over to Parcel.js and want to stick with just Webpack, you don't need to worry about these, but we're gonna need to add in the script tag for the index TSX file for Parcel.js for the way that it bundles everything. So we're gonna do that here. And then we also need to add in the CSS tag that it will generate. Okay, so the next thing we do is add in our Redux specific stuff. So I'm going to continue to kind of go one file at a time and explain the files, but in the past you would have normally seen me, I'd create a file as an example, right? So I'd come in here, we need to make a reducer file. So we'll do the to-do reducer. We're going to do a to-do actions file. And I would normally tell you I'm going to type in and then I'd fast forward me typing everything out and then review it at the end, just to kind of conserve a little bit of time to keep the video as short as I can. And this time I'm going to try and just cut that part out. I'm going to go ahead and type out each piece, and then I'll just cut forward and you'll see a finished file. And then as usual, I'll go over everything in the file for you to kind of understand. And so we'll still go one at a time, but I'm just going to try and cut out that super fast forwarded part with me typing everything out. So before I get into filling out the actions file and the reducer file, one of the things we're going to need to do is change the, because I didn't want to just a random string here. Well, I didn't want a string. I wanted to change these to a GUID. So what we're going to do is import a package that you might have seen that I had pulled in, which is GUID TypeScript. And so I had pulled that in right here. I can't honestly remember. I think I already had that in the package JSON from the original React tutorial video. So it should be there. If it's not, you'll need to add this and install it in. This just makes it easy to be able to create a GUID, which is, if you don't know what a GUID is, it's a globally unique identifier. So it's just a super unique, longer alphanumeric string that has a specific format to it. And so I like using these for IDs rather than having to do like to do 1 or to do 2 and kind of just increment that way. It's nice and easy to ensure that things are unique, especially when you have lists of things and you need to have keys for those. Let's see, where is yeah, so when you do keys for like lists on a page, right, you've probably seen cases where it says, oh, like we had duplicate keys or we have no key specified, so and you'll see in the browser to complain about it. So this way you can ensure that each key that you give a list of elements on a page are unique. So that's kind of why I like that, but a personal preference. So this is what I'm just doing here. So then the next piece is I'm going to go ahead and fill out the actions file, and then we'll cut forward and you'll see what I have here, and we'll go over what's in the actions file. Okay, so as you can see here, I've pulled in again the GUID from GUID TypeScript and then action from Redux. And I've created an enum. I mean, there's obviously a much less verbose way to do this, but I kind of prefer using all the types to kind of make things absolutely clear. I come from starting with strongly typed languages, and I just kind of prefer those. And as I've told you in the past, I'm a big fan of TypeScript, which is why you may see this a little bit represented a little bit differently in other people's projects, but this is how I kind of like to do it. So first is identifying all the actions that you want, and you can certainly just do like add to do, but I actually noticed, I think it was the React router, when you add the React router to the middleware for Redux, you'll see that it's prepended with, I think router or something. It's been a little while since I've looked at it, but there's something prepended here so that it doesn't clash with other actions that other people might have for their reducers. So I've kind of adopted that behavior for when I create reducers and actions as well, as identifying the particular kind of section or topic, right? So if I added I don't know, maybe like a blog page and I had a bunch of blog actions, then I would probably append this with blog or blogs or something like that, just to make sure it's clear where that action's coming for and what it's intended for. So I usually will prepend it in this way. And the @ signs are nothing special. I think this is what I saw in the React router one. So you could just do to-dos like this if you want. So it's just a habit that I've created. It's not a hard requirement that you include it this way. But we're just adding to-dos and removing to-dos. So these are the two enum action types. And then for each one, creating the interface to represent what the action creator, because that is what this is. And so the interface to represent what adding a to-do, adding to-do action, how it's represented. And then you can see that this is extending the Redux action with the type that we're doing. So in this case, the to-do action type. And here we're including the type, which you've probably seen before if you've seen Redux, and it's the add to do, and then the payload, which in this case is just the string of the to do, because we don't need to supply the ID because we're going to create the ID in the reducer later. So then we're using the iadd to do interface here to represent what our action creator is going to return, and then we've got our payload here, and then the same for remove to do. Here we're supplying the ID of the to do that we want to remove, and then Here is a union type to represent that a to-do action can be any of the actions that we've defined. In this case, it's just I add to do and remove to do. But as your actions grow longer, list grows longer for more of what you're doing, or your project becomes more complex, this will obviously get longer and have more things added to it. So moving on to the next one, I'll do the reducer and I'll fill this out. We'll snap forward and you'll see this completed and we'll go through it. All right, so here is the finished reducer. So the first part we'll go over is imports. We're importing our I-to-do interface, and remember earlier we edited that to use the ID here. And then reducer obviously from Redux, and then our to-do action union type and the to-do action enum. And then we're defining our state for our reducer. In this case, I'm using map. Oh, this is what that was. So earlier I had mentioned the ES 2015 collection from the tsconfig. That's what that was for. It was to be able to have support for map, because if you don't have that in the lib definition there in the tsconfig, then this will underline with like red squiggly and doesn't like it. So that's what allowed the use of map. So this is just allowing basically a key value pair object where the key does not have to be a string like a normal JavaScript object. And this way I could use ID, and I didn't want to do a list of I-to-dos because I just thought it was quicker from a lookup perspective to be able to delete things instead of having to slice them out of a list. And so you can certainly do this as an array of I-to-dos, and then find the to-do in a list and remove based on its ID and slice that out of there if you wanted to do it that way. I'm not a huge fan of doing it that way, but I'm sure there's probably cases for why that would be more performant or better. But I thought it was cleaner doing it this way for a small and simple example like this. There are cases where a list may be better or more performant. Not quite sure at the moment. But so if you wanted to make this an array of I-to-dos, feel free to do that. And then you can adjust your actions to remove or add things as necessary. So in this case, right, if we did a list of I-to-dos instead, we would be able to just do to-dos.push and then push that particular thing into the list. So it's relatively simple for that. And so then for removing, you need to slice that out and remove that item. But for me, I'm doing map, so that's how we're going to set that. So then we're going to do an initial state here where we initialize to-dos with an empty map. And then our reducer is of type I-to-do state. And then we're supplying our default state here. And then we're saying our actions are going to be to-do actions. And then this returns our overall I-to-do state. And so you can certainly do ifs here. I kind of prefer switches, especially when this gets longer and you have a lot more actions. I've seen plenty of people for simple reducers doing if else options. You can do that as well. I just kind of prefer switches. One thing you'll kind of notice here though is that in a lot of cases, most people probably wouldn't use braces on a case switch. This prevents cases where you need to use the same variable. So we'll actually show what that looks like. So if I remove this set of braces, right, from a pure code perspective, this actually is not, there's nothing wrong with this, but the minute we try and do this, it claims that, so if we were in like JavaScript, it wouldn't care. But here it's saying that we can't redeclare a block scope variable, right? So if we did something like let, it would not care, right? But obviously we don't really want to do that because we only really want it scoped to what we're doing. So the way around that is just to, actually we'll just go ahead and back up. So the way around that is to add these braces in, which just ensures that everything inside this case is not bleeding over into any other scope from the other cases. This is not something you have to worry about in a language like C#, so it's kind of weird that you have to do that here, and kind of a pain in my opinion, but I'd rather do the braces here personally than having to do let in one and then just reassign the variable in other cases. So I just think this allows me to ensure that everything that's going on inside this particular case function or case block is scoped and handled and named, and everything is just for that particular spot, I guess. So that's how I did that here. And then, so we're on our add to do, we're creating a new GUID, and then we're putting that ID into our new to do. And then the action payload is our string from what we add in the UI later. And then in the to-dos, we're creating a new to-do map, and then we're setting it with the new key and value. And then we're returning the state with a new set of to-dos. Then, and as you can see here, we're returning a new state because in Redux, our states need to be immutable. So that's why we're creating the new map and then kind of merging it in here to our new state. And then if we have remove to do, action come in, then we're making a copy using the spread operator of the current to-dos, deleting the particular one from, in this case, the payload is the ID that we saw earlier in the action. And so we're deleting that particular key and value pair here. And then again, returning the state with the new to-dos. And then if we have no action mapping and some other action is passed in, then we have it mapped, it's just going to return a new copy of the state. So that's our reducer. So the next piece is to connect in our UI to our, the next piece we're going to do is create our store config so that our store is all set up. And so we're going to go ahead and create a store config.ts. And I didn't want that in that folder. I want that in the root source folder. So I'll fill this out and then we'll go over it once I'm done. All right, so there's a decent amount of things to go over in this. And so the first one is going to be that we're pulling in everything from the to-dos reducer because we had multiple, if I can go back to that, exports. We're exporting the state and the reducer. And so I wanted to be able to pull both of those in, but you could certainly just do the I2do state like so, and the reducer if you wanted to do that, but I did not. So that's just personal preference. So then for Redux, we're pulling in the combine reducers, the reducer type, any action type, store type, and then the create store function. And we're creating our entire application state. In this case, we just have the one. I didn't pull in the router reducer, which you can certainly do if it's something you need or want. I didn't really need it for this simple example, but you can certainly pull in the router reducer. But take a note though, there is some kind of special things to take into consideration when you're adding the router reducer in and how you create the history for that. There's plenty of documentation for that. I can include some of that in the description below if you're curious about adding that in, but it's pretty well documented. There's a lot of different tutorials and stuff on it if that's something you want to do. But basically, as your application grows, you're going to have likely more than one reducer for different sections. Like you might have a UI that has a users section, or maybe like earlier brought up the blogs, like maybe you have a blog website and then a users section or a videos section or something. And so you might have reducers for each section of your application, and you here, if you had a users one, you might do users. It might be like users and whoops, I user state, and then you would just keep adding things in here as your application state grew. So moving in is we need to configure the root reducer, which is basically the collection of all of the different reducers from your application. So in this case, we only have the one, so it's pretty simple. But this combine reducers function that Redux supplies, it takes in this iApplication state and any action, because obviously one reducer is going to have like to do action. You may have a user action for a user's reducer. So you can't be specific on which action here, because your whole reducer, your root reducer, that's a combination of everything, needs to be able to handle all the actions. And then obviously your iApplication state. So we're combining all that here, and then we're providing the one reducer. And then The last piece is configuring the store. So here we have a store by application state. We are taking all of our reducers, which is created by our combine or configure reducer function, and then we're using the create store function provided by Redux to pass in all reducers. And one thing I didn't configure here, just because it was again not something I really needed. It was kind of going to be a bit of overkill, I guess. But one thing that, if you don't know, Redux supports is called middleware. And where I personally think middleware really shines is when you have asynchronous actions or processes that need to take place. So as an example, if you have a web request that you need to make to some API to get some data, you can trigger an action to make that web request. And then when that comes back, when that response comes back, then you can process that data however you need, and then the middleware can call another action to then set the reducer to whatever state that needs to be done, and then the UI component can then update when the state is updated in the reducer. And so for something like just adding to-do actions, there was nothing asynchronous really there happening, so it just felt like an overkill to add that. So if you want to add middleware in because you are making web requests, I'll include a link in the description below for how to do that, because it was not really needed to kind of showcase some of the differences between using Redux versus the context API, and I felt like that would just add in a lot of extra time to kind of explain that and showcase what that looks like. So in this case, I just wanted to do a simple store with no middleware. But just know that this function here would look a little bit different if you were adding in middleware to the picture. So then we have our hot module dependency replacement dependencies, and so it's just the path of our different components, and then accepting those in, and then we replace the root reducer so that everything updates appropriately with hot module replacement, and then we export our store. So that's that one. Then the next part we're going to move on to is the connecting. So as should be our final step here, I think, where we are going to connect the components or the UI components to the reducer components. And that for me is, I think that's can be done a little bit differently in different ways with different packages. I didn't pull in some of the ones that some people might use for this. So take the way I'm doing it with a grain of salt. I think it's kind of a nice way though. But how I generally prefer to do it is I like to try and keep the UI layer separate from the connection layer. And what I mean by that is an example, right? If we went into this to-do list component, a lot of people would probably just add in their connect, and you'll see why I refer to connect if you're not familiar with react-redux, but there's a connect method that merges everything all together nicely. If you're not familiar with that, there's a method that you need to call and some like props and some state prop connection stuff that you need to make that we'll get into here in a second. A lot of people will just add that right into their component file. I like to be able to keep it where it's easy to lift and shift your UI components to different things later on. So I keep those separate by creating a container file. And so I would do something like to-do list container.ts. And then all of that connection logic I would put in here so that if you're not using Redux, it doesn't affect the component from fundamentally working. So that the component can still be a very React component, and other people can maybe use that for something else later if they don't want to use Redux in the mix with that particular component. So I'll fill this out so you can kind of better see what I mean, and then we'll kind of go over it once I'm done. All right, so I filled this out. There's a couple things here that aren't going to be, they're underlined red because I haven't filled them out. They're going to be in the to-do list component here in a few minutes. So we'll add those in, but this is everything we would kind of need. And a lot of times, like I said, these are things that people would just add in to the component file, and you can certainly do that. Again, it's personal preference. I just like to keep it this way so that the Redux mixture into this is kept separate. So a couple of things we need is the connect method, which we're pulling in from react-redux, and the dispatch for Redux, the iApplication state, and then the add to-do action that we're going to add in here. So map state to props is how we hook in different parts of the state or the whole state from our application state into a particular thing that we want for that UI component. So in this case, we want the to-do list component to be able to have access to the states tracking of to-dos, right? So in this case, we end up getting the whole state. So if we had, as an example, if we had more than just the to-dos reducer, right, or the I-to-do state, if we had in the users reducer and the I-user state that I kind of showed an example of earlier, you'd probably see, state.users and then whatever was part of that particular state. But obviously, we only have to-dos, and so this is the to-dos state. So it does seem kind of silly and repetitive because we have a list of to-dos or a map of to-dos in our to-dos reducer. So that's why it's to-dos, and then you can see here in our IntelliSense on the screen. So here this was to-dos. This is our application state, and then our I-to-do state for to-dos. And then if we do to-dos again, we've got our map of GUID to I-to-do. So that links those two together. We don't need that there. And then our dispatch, this is hooking up the actions that we're supplying so that calling a method. So in this case, we're supplying a add to do method that dispatches an add to do action. So we're saying that this method or function is taking in a label string, and then it's going to call in our add to do action creator, which is then going to return the action that the dispatcher is going to dispatch. And so that's coming from the I-to-do list dispatch props, and then the other one is coming from the I-to-do list state props. And then we pass both of those in to our connect method, and then we pass all this in to our to-do list component. So now that that's done, we'll move into creating or adding in what we need, the I-to-do list state props and dispatch props to our UI component. So I'll fill those in here and then we'll go over them. All right, so I'm doing this one a little bit in sections. So I've added in the two things that we needed first, which was our two new interfaces. It's the to-dos that we want. We're saying, regardless of whether you're using Redux or not, we're saying for our state props for our component, we want you to supply us with a map of to-dos and a function of add to-do for adding a to-do. And so we will add that into the function component here. And then I'm going to take those in as props. And this just if you don't know what this is, this and just merges in these two as if they're one singular thing. So technically, if you wanted to, additionally, you could do a export type of like do I-to-do list props, and then I-to-do list dispatch props and I-to-do list state props, right? And then now we've just got one that's both of them, and then you can certainly do I-to-do type, and you could do that. I just didn't really feel that that was super necessary, but if you like it to be a little bit cleaner and not have the and sign there, you can certainly do that as well. Let's move this back. All right, so the next piece is that we don't really need the I-to-do store anymore because we're no longer tracking this in the to-do list component. We're tracking this in the reducer, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then we need to change all of this stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of that, and then we'll do our, I think I might have deleted one on accident there. And then we'll do our on add. And we're going to call our add to do method with the current state of label input. And then we're going to clear the label here. So rather than, because this add to do is only going to add the to do to our to do reducer state. And so we still want to be able to clear our text field where our label input is. So that's why we're creating our own internal onAdd method that then calls the add to do method and then set label. And then we're going to make some modifications here for the rest of this. And so because we're dealing with a map now, we still want to be able to turn this into a list of things. And because map doesn't have a map function on it like a normal object would, to be able to kind of iterate through the different keys on an object. So the way we can do that is using array from, and so we'll do that, and I'll finish adding this here, and then we'll go forward through it here in a moment. So now we finish this. So basically we're taking in the to-dos and then a function that's going to return our to-do, similar to what we had before. And in this case, it's taking the ID and the to-do, or the key and the value pair from the map, and then turning it into a function, or using it in a function that we can use to return the to-do component. And you'll see here red, that this is still underlying squiggly because we haven't changed the to-do list item component to have its ID as a GUID yet. And so we'll change that here in a moment, but this is what that's going to look like for taking a map and then turning it into a list of to-dos. And then nothing else changes here. So we're still going to export our default list. And as you can see, as we mentioned, this is still perfectly usable without Redux. There's nothing Redux oriented in here. We're just saying we want you to supply us with the to-dos for my to-do list component and a function to add to-dos. And so we're saying we're going to leave it up to you, whoever's calling us as the to-do, we're the to-do list component. We're going to leave adding to-dos and tracking the to-dos up to you somewhere else. I'm just going to be a displayer of these to-dos. And so this way we can still move this component somewhere else or use it in another way without Redux if we wanted to. So that's kind of why I like doing it this way, and then keeping the container separate, so all of that Redux logic can be in its own file and makes things easier to lift and shift, rather than having all of this inside this component and having this component have dependencies, or this whole component file have dependencies on Redux. So that's kind of where I think the benefit lands with that. So the last thing I think we need to do here is we'll go into our to-do list item component, and we'll change this to a GUID. And we'll add in our use of the GUID TypeScript package again. And then this needs to be a GUID as well. And then because we're also not supplying our so I lied again. So not quite the last thing. So just like we added a container to connect Redux to the component, right? We're not, as you can see, we have nothing here for deleting our component yet. There's nothing here for deleting the component. And so we still need, or for deleting the to-do. So here we were originally letting our to-do list component supply the delete function for the underlying to-do. But now we want to supply that from Redux. So I'm going to add in the changes that we need to make in this file, and then we'll get into adding the container for the to-do list item component as well. So that was pretty quick and easy. As you see, we had already done the switch for this to a GUID, and I left this the same, and then I added in, or I removed the delete function here, and then I moved it to a dispatch props with remove to do, and that was also a GUID before with the delete one. And then we've, like we did with the to-do list component, we pulled in the to-do list state props and the to-do list dispatch props here. And now we're saying in our props, we have this remove to-do that we're going to use to delete the to-do. And we're just saying whoever is supplying this, we're going to leave it up to you to handle however you're going to handle remove to-do. And so our last piece here is going to be the to-do, if I can type, to-do list item container. So I'll fill this out and we'll go over it. This is the all the things that we're going to need to pull in. So the state and dispatch props that we just added in our to-do list item component, and then our GUID TypeScript, the remove to-do action creator, the connect as we did before, dispatch as we did before from Redux, the to-do list item UI component, and then our application state. So in this case, we don't need the state, and you can see that's why it's grayed out here because we're not using it. But what we do want to do is this pattern, which you didn't see me do before, is making it so that we can say that our own props, this is what we're expecting. So this is going to come from Redux, right? But when we supply own props, we're saying we want this to be supplied by the person using us, regardless of the connection with Redux. So that's why in this case, you can see we're still providing ID and label because we're saying we're not going to get that from Redux. We still need you, the person creating this component, regardless of whether the connect method is in between or not. Because when you're using this component, there's nothing that tells us like, oh, hey, yeah, this component's using Redux. No, like we're just saying these are the properties that you need to supply regardless. So that's what these own props are, is so we're skipping the state from Redux and we're saying that the calling component needs to supply these two properties, and that's where we're getting those from. But then in the dispatch to props mapping here, we're supplying the remove to do function that's then dispatching the remove to do action creator with that ID in there, and then everything is the same here. So that's it. And it would look, sorry, I'm just lying a lot. So the problem here, why you see this red, is because now we have to change this to use the to-do component from the to-do container and not the one from the actual UI component, because we want the react-redux connected version. And so now you can see that we pulled in the one from the container rather than the one from the component. Now everything is kind of mapping up. All the properties are the same. And so we're good to go there. And that is adding in Redux. So there you can see there's quite a bit here that, adding our actions file and our reducer and having these containers to kind of link everything together. I think the way I've done it here is pretty clean, and I definitely think that as your application grows, it can be really useful. But we do need to still go over our context API in the next video, because as I said at the beginning, this is going to be a two-part series, and in the second part we'll go over the context API and my final thoughts between the two. So this is going to be it for me, and as always, it's not it for you, especially if you haven't subscribed before. So go down there, hit that like button. If you want to see part 2, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon so you can see the part 2 of the two-part series for React State Management, and I will see you guys in the next one.